listener production.
Hi, Simon Beaton here with The Briefing. It used to be if you wanted to read a smutty book, you'd do it in secret. It wasn't the genre that you'd expect to find in your average book club. But think back to ye old times of Tumblr and it's pretty clear social media has definitely changed things up. Now, search hashtag spicybook or smut on TikTok and you will find hundreds of thousands of videos. Scroll through and you'll find people sharing reviews, recommendations, arguing over favourite tropes and characters and more. But the popularity has also broken outside of the confines of the internet, with smut series making the New York Times bestsellers list. So, what's behind this boom in extremely raunchy books? You might recognise Esmé Louise James. She joined Antoinette Lattouf on the Weekend Briefing to discuss her book Kinky History, where she explores the kinky habits of humans throughout history. And in this episode, she joins Bension Siebert to talk about smut.
Esmé, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you so much for having me to talk about this topic.
Define smut.
Smut is generally, by today's standard, any kind of novel that involves erotic content first and foremost. There's a bit of a debate about how much erotic content you need to have for a book to be taken from romance to the version of smut. I would generally put it about 20-30%. You know, it doesn't have to be that much to be a little bit fun.
Right, okay. Could you tell me the story of the rise of smut? Where does that start and where is it now?
Smut starts back in the 17th, 18th century, which is what I love so much that I'm doing my PhD on it. And what's so fun about this is it happens when we have the rise of literacy, when women especially start being able to read and being able to author novels. We have this idea of smut. Up until then, smut novels have existed for men in an elite class. A lot of the books that men would pass around their salons and their clubs were very smutty novels. But they didn't call it that. It was very high art. As soon as women are able to read and write novels and sentimental novels, it becomes something that's kind of dirty and something that we see as not being very highbrow, which is kind of where the debate is today. And I find that so interesting that we're having the same conversation that we did 250 years ago about whether these novels are quite lowbrow, whether they're intellectual or whether they're just frivolous pieces of trash, really.
In, I guess, the modern era, reading smut may have been seen as sort of shameful. Some time ago, you're the one who knows the history, so please tell me if I'm wrong. But I suppose you couldn't find them in the main section of bookstores. So what is the role of the social media in, I guess, the last 10 years in changing that story?
It's really interesting because the normalization of smut novels actually starts really around the 1950s, 1970s.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
yeah, it was all for academic purposes. So something like the Fanny Hill, which is considered the first pornographic novel, was taken to court in this time. And basically academics were arguing for the fact that these novels shouldn't be censored, that if we're able to read them in the 1700s, we have to read them now. They have artistic qualities, they have purpose. And the role of social media, I think, in all of this is we have something like TikTok that comes along as well. And people are able to kind of converse about the fact that they enjoy these novels, that they have this kind of escapism and fantasy in a way that's really safe to engage in when it comes to erotic content. Far more than kind of visual forms of media, this is a form where people are able to put themselves into a fantasy in a very safe way that you know that no one's been hurt and let the imagination kind of do its thing. So social media has really normalized the reading of smut, which again, previous to that has been very academic and elite. Then it was seen as something that you have to kind of change the cover of the book to be able to read it in public.
Yeah.
And now you see people reading fairy smut all over the place. Every time I see someone read A Court of Thorns and Roses, girl, I know what's up.
I know what's going on. How would you describe the history of social media in relation to it? Because I guess the Tumblr era is quite different to the TikTok era now.
There's a lot more conversation. Now, Tumblr, I wasn't a Tumblr girly, but Tumblr has a very kind of like aesthetic appeal, and there was the kind of conversation of smut still at that time was something that you didn't really touch as much. Romance and aestheticizing romance novels was a very Tumblr thing. What TikTok is really changing is the honesty to be able to talk about the fact that we can enjoy eroticism, that it can be a very healthy part of sexuality to enjoy erotic content. And this isn't really a new thing because we see TV shows like, we've had Game of Thrones and all of these shows that we were watching on a mass scale. I was watching it with my parents and that was erotic content in a visual media. But there's something about a book, because we do it in private, that we're really changing when it comes to book talk, where people are trying to say that this is a totally normal and healthy way to engage in both reading and erotic desire.
Can you talk a bit about that element of it being kind of a safer version of that kind of eroticism? Are people using book smut as an alternative to porn?
They are. And this is a really good conversation for us to be having when we don't really talk about how damaging a lot of pornographic media can be. When you have pornographic sites in particular that we don't know about the safety of the performers, we don't know about the ethics, we don't know about the consent. There's a lot that can go wrong in the erotic media that a huge percentage of the population access on a daily basis. And we haven't been having that conversation. Now, come on to the current book talk debate where I guess, one side of the argument is saying that reading smutty novels is just as bad as watching porn and having an addiction to porn. And the other half of the conversation is saying, well, no, because in this way, you let your imagination do the work for you. No one is being harmed. You're able to engage in fantasies. And fantasies, we have to remember, are not a reflection of how we act in real life, what we want in real life. They are fantasies for a reason. And we know from a lot of evidence and a lot of, incredible sex researchers that fantasies are very healthy to engage in. And they are an escapist release. Book talkers who are able to kind of engage in smut novels, even ones that they wouldn't want practice on in their real life, it's a very healthy outlet for these kind of desires.
Is there a degree to which there are characters in smut books where the way that they talk, the way that they act might be sexy in a fantasy kind of a way, but would be an absolute red flag if it actually happened in real life? Yeah.
I love that because I've seen some fantastic parody videos on TikTok where people are saying, you're reading your book, I'm going to reference A Court of Thorns and Roses as well, and Reese, who's the main love interest, is growling and saying, you're mine, I own you, all of this, and, we're eating it up, and then people are like, in real life, if anyone did that, I'm like, who are you? Get out of here. Who do you think you are? Why are you growling? Stop snarling at me. So, again, that is that really healthy fantasy. I don't really want a man to growl at me, but I do want to read about Rysand and his fairy wings, okay?
So fair. How has the writing itself changed over time?
In some ways, it hasn't, which is a really lovely thing when I spend my life reading 18th century pornographic novels. They do tend to be, some of them are very, very flowery and very euphemistic. Others are far dirtier than anything that is written today. The writings that we had from people like the Marquis de Sade, for instance, are so crass and exploitative and really, they wouldn't be published today.
Immoral.
Yes,
Illegal.
absolutely immoral, completely.
Terrible.
And I think that says a lot as well about we actually have become quite conservative in a way as a society, in a way that we don't realise. Because it's good, because writers have in their head things like respect, first and foremost. That's nice, isn't it? In the 21st century, we have conversations of respect and consent. And that has changed the way that we write novels. And if you read the novels that are blowing up today, like A Court of Thorns and Roses and Fourth Wing, a lot of the relationships that we're seeing explored are very respectful, and they do have a kind of romance at the centre, and they're also very women-centric. That's something that's quite new as well.
Is the heart of Book Talk targeted towards women? Or is there a more diverse audience?
TikTok really has created a very diverse community in nearly everything it does. That's not to say that BookTokers are not dominated mainly by women, because we know that from book sales. It is a huge percentage of women. But what I always love, and this is, going back to the 1800s as well, when women were the main readers of something like Jane Austen, for instance, who was considered a pornographic writer at her time. And that's very interesting to remember. Pride and Prejudice was actually considered more lowbrow than pornographic novels at the time. Where women go, they tend to create a very diverse and inclusive community, and that is really what BookTok has fostered. Some of my favourite videos have been watching reactions to dads who suddenly get hooked to Fourth Wing and A Court of Thorns and Roses, and they're, saying, I really need to go pick up my kids and go to my job. However, all I want to do is go home and read about this fairy romance. And I love that. So yes, it may be the majority of women, but I think when you normalise that conversation, it's open to everyone. Everyone loves some fairies.
Well, just finally, what are your absolute top smut books?
Oh, of all time. Now, I'm going to go through some of the ones I've referenced. So Fanny Hill, you've got to put Fanny Hill on the list. You have to go back to your original pornographic novel. That is a wonderful book. It's funny. It's lighthearted. I've mentioned A Court of Thorns and Roses many, many times. And I think that is a great gateway for a lot of people into this world of both romance and smut. And finally, do you know what? I want to put Dangerous Liaisons on there. Dangerous Liaisons was the book that inspired Cruel Intentions, the cult classic from the early 2000s. And there's a reason that everyone loves that movie and that story and why we tell it so many times. So I think Dangerous Liaisons.
Wonderful. Well, Esmé, this has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me to come and talk about fairies.
Esmé Louise James speaking with Bension Siebert there. And if you want to know more about her work, listen back to her chat with Antoinette Lattouf on the Weekend Briefing, where Esmé dives into her favourite kinky stories throughout history. Speaking of the Weekend Briefing, it will be back again. And what have you got on?
Hey guys, I was super fortunate to sit down with Ziggy Ramo, rapper, artist, author who has just published his memoir, Humans, with a question mark. If you have a lot of questions about that question mark, I did too. We sit down and talk about his Wick and South Sea Islander heritage. And his book is really an invitation for readers to fight for a future that restores humanity to all Australians. It's a fascinating chat. You won't want to miss it.
Awesome. That's all for this episode of The Briefing. If you like what you heard, please do share this episode with your friends. We love it when you spread the word. I'm Simon Beaton. Catch you next time.